Okay, we'll be starting. I think we'll just give a couple of minutes for people to come in, so to speak. Okay, so good afternoon, welcome. My name is Ruth Owen and I'm the Deputy Director at Fianza. I'm looking forward to chairing this debate, timely debate on will the Fit455 package make the housing crisis better or worse? Please allow me to start with a little bit of background about Fianza. We're the European Federation of Organisations working on homelessness. We've co-organised this event with the Abbé Pierre Foundation, which is one of the most important actors on housing exclusion in France. Every year, we jointly publish the only annual overview of housing exclusion in Europe. And so both of our organisations are working on the energy transition in buildings from the perspective of those who struggle most to access and maintain housing in Europe today. 9% of low-income households in the EU live in severe housing deprivation, 40% are overburdened by housing costs, and 18% of poor households can't keep their home adequately warm. Poor housing conditions have a significant negative impact on health and well-being. So the Green Deal commits the EU to becoming climate neutral in 2050 and to leaving no one behind. A core element of the transition is the decarbonisation of the building stock. The Commission therefore launched its Renovation Wave strategy in October 2020, outlining plans to double energy renovation rates in 10 years. The legislative proposals of the Fit455 package will help to deliver the Renovation Wave and obviously the Green Deal overall. The first part of the package was published in June, and we're all very eagerly awaiting the second part. So it seems like a good juncture to have this debate and to dig into some of these questions because the Renovation Wave offers huge opportunities to tackle inadequate housing and energy poverty, but it's far from guaranteed that it will leave no one behind, and there is a significant risk of worsening access to decent, affordable housing for poor and vulnerable households. So the aim of today's debate is really to dig into both the risks and the opportunities of the Renovation Wave and ask how to design it so that it really does leave no one behind. We've got a great lineup of speakers to help us with this today. I'd like to say a very warm thank you in advance and also to the participants. Very much looking forward to the question and answer. And don't hesitate to use the chat throughout. In terms of practicalities, we have 2.5 hours. There is French and English interpretation available for the event. So you'll see the interpretation icon on the toolbar at the bottom, and you can choose the language that you want to listen to. We have 2 panels, and we'll have a question and answer session after each panel. So please use the chat or the Q&A function to raise questions. We'll gather them and put them to the speakers during the Q&A. Feel free to post in the chat, as I said. And it's helpful if you can make sure that your name and organization is visible in the participants list. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first panel, which will focus on the regulatory framework of the Renovation Wave, especially the Energy Efficiency in Buildings Directive and the Energy Performance in Buildings Directive and the Energy Efficiency Directive. And we have 4 speakers in this panel. Our first speaker is Serena Pontoglio. She is team leader on buildings policy and Renovation Wave implementation at the European Commission's Directorate General for Energy. So she's working very much on the Energy Performance in Buildings Directive, and she is going to give us a little bit of a presentation on what to expect. Our second speaker is Louise Sunderland from the Regulatory Assistance Project. Louise is a researcher, advisor and policy analyst working on energy efficiency and sustainability in the energy and building sector. She's an expert on energy efficiency, energy poverty and carbon revenue recycling. And our third speaker is Emmanuel Kors, who's the director of the International Union of Property Owners, which is a pan-European not-for-profit umbrella organization for national property owners organizations. And our fourth speaker is Sarah Couchou, who's responsible for European affairs at the Fondation Pierre. As I said earlier, it's one of the most well-known organizations working on housing exclusion in France. So thank you very much to all of our panelists, and I'd like to invite Serena to kick off this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth, and good afternoon, everybody, to all the participants and to the other panelists. It's really my pleasure to kick off this discussion for this very important topic, and indeed quite timely. I work in the European Commission, and thanks, Ruth, for the introduction. We are indeed the team that is working on the PPT revision and also on the Renovation Wave implementation together with other services across the DG, because of course this goes beyond also energy policies, but also other policies across the DG. So just some general remarks, but I think the important data and evidence has been already presented by Ruth. Just to highlight that indeed building sector is a very important sector for really a focus for energy policy, for achieving the goals of decarbonization for the whole society. We know that in buildings we consume basically 40% of all emissions all around the economy. So it's really a sector to look at if we want to take seriously our goals to reduce emissions and energy by 2030, but also in the long term. And that's the angle, the primary angle from which we come into this discussion from the point of view of buildings policy and energy buildings policy. But we know that is a very narrow angle, because when we think of buildings and households living in buildings, buildings are not just an energy asset or an economic asset, but are really an area where to focus on to also address concerns in relation to social exclusion, vulnerability to high energy prices. So indeed, even if the angle is that of energy and addressing the cause of high emission in a sector that is not decarbonizing as fast as it should, we should really take into account what buildings means really for society and for a just transition across the EU. And that is also the challenge, to take into account also the differences that we have in the member states, the differences that we have in across society when we look at buildings as such. So this is really one of the set of issues that we have been looking at in the whole Fitfor55 package. As Ruth has already said, it's a set of legislative proposals that the Commission adopted in July that also address buildings to some extent, especially in the Energy Efficiency Directive, with a focus on public buildings and also on social buildings, with a reinforced encouragement to member states also to achieve energy savings for those buildings that also matters the most from the point of view of the social perspective. And of course, we also have measures in relation to buildings in the Renewables Directive and the extension of emission trading to heating in buildings, so to really address the externality of carbon that is related to the use of fossil fuel in buildings. But this is basically what is part of the package as published in July. And there is one piece that is still on the making, which is the review of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which is due by the end of the year. So we are really in the intensive phase of preparation of this proposal. and to review the PPD that basically currently sets standards for new buildings, for renovation, for technical building system, and also provide indications for the use of financing for buildings. We have had across the year a series of events and consultation with stakeholders to really also learn from the experiences that are already ongoing in initiatives and policies to increase the rate of renovation of buildings, and also with all stakeholders. And we have organized this stakeholder consultation, also focusing on the topics that have been already indicated by the Renovation Wave strategy as those issues that are most important if we really want to increase the decarbonization of the building sector. And for that, it is really clear from all analysis that we need to renovate more buildings, that we need to address the buildings that consumes most energy, and that we have to do that at a much higher scale impact to what we do now. And we have also identified that a doubling of renovation rate basically would be needed to be in line with our climate and with our climate and energy goals, and that a promising instrument to increase the rate of renovation is to set minimum energy performance standard for buildings. So to say that buildings in some segment should respect some limits, and this would trigger renovation, especially of the worst performing buildings. Indeed, from all our analysis, and I think it's quite clear to everyone that has worked in this sector or has experience in this sector, we see that there are really several buildings across the EU that are in poor state, and that this clearly combines also with the difficult living situation for people that live in those buildings. So it's really a priority to address those buildings from all angles. We have also received a recommendation, of course, from stakeholders and from our consultation during this process that we have conducted. And I think there are two main ones that we really have taken into account in the shaping of the revision of the PPD to really address the objective that we have set for this revision. And one key point that, of course, you also very much addressed in this discussion today is really to ensure a just and a sustainable transition that is also just. And for that, we really need also to address the availability of adequate financing, because to address those buildings, we need investments in the building sector, targeted investment and financial instruments that are fit for that, from the public funding, but also the private funding with social safeguards. So we really need a very comprehensive set of instruments. So that's a very important recommendation, and that's a very important point. And then the other important point is that we need to balance somehow the importance of having common efforts across the EU with national conditions, with the national characteristic and national specificities. And for us, working on EU policy, of course, this is a very important dimension to take into account, that requires careful design of instruments to really achieve the goals that we have set in the building sector. So these are really the two angles that we and the two key criteria that we have been taking into account to really think how the EPBD, how common rules across the EU can really drive the change that we need, and be in line with the vision of a socially just transition. I would just mention that for what concern funding, of course, in the Fit455 package, there is also a new element in that sense, which is the Social Climate Fund, which is aimed at being basically use funds from the extension of the ETS to buildings, which is specifically designed to deliver social safeguards for the more vulnerable consumers, but at the same time to address also the problem at its core, so to allow for investments in those buildings that are more in need, so the one for which the energy performance is really the worst, and those that are also owned or occupied by the lowest income class in each member state. So we really see the use of this fund that is proposed by the Commission very much in line with the goals of the PPD, really as an instrument that can be twinned to achieve the common goals that we have. I will stop here, Ruth, for my intervention, to leave also the floor to the other panelists. I'm happy to take questions, and of course I'm also happy to continue this dialogue in future, because I think it will be very important for us to collect your views once we will have the PPD proposal on the table adopted, so to discuss together really on the basis of what the Commission will propose. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Serena. I'm sure that there are lots of follow-up questions, also perhaps from our panelists, but I suggest that I give the floor to each of them, and then we come back to questions for all four of you after that. So I'd like to hand over now, please, to Louise, who I think will respond a little bit in terms of the EPBD and draw out some of the main challenges and opportunities from her perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to Serena for that overview. And I really am going to, I hope, build upon, but certainly I think reinforce some of the key points that Serena said around kind of getting this right. I really welcomed Serena's focus in what she was saying there on the introduction of minimum energy performance standards, because I think the housing crisis, part of the housing crisis we're seeing, is a crisis of standards. You know, we have a housing supply crisis, a housing affordability crisis, but we also have a housing standards crisis. And I think Ruth pointed that out in her introduction. And, you know, obviously the poor performance, the poor standards of our homes are leading to families living in unhealthy conditions and unaffordable housing. And I think this is brought into much greater focus very, very recently with the fossil gas price crisis that we're seeing, where you know, energy prices are absolutely going through the roof. So it is really important to raise the standard of all housing, of all buildings, in line with the great decarbonisation challenge we have, but very importantly, the worst performing most urgently. And of course, these are the by their nature, the worst performing homes have been missed so far in our renovation efforts. They have been the ones that have not been renovated under this kind of incentive-based approach that we've been taking to renovation. So I do feel that the kind of minimum energy performance standards, the more regulated approach is absolutely needed now, particularly for these homes that have been missed, occupied disproportionately by the lowest income households. So I would say I can't really underestimate the potential of MEPs. However, these standards alone, regulations, do not create successful renovations. They provide us with clarity, with a communication tool, with a backstop if needed, but they are not the central point of getting the renovation done successfully, particularly in complex buildings, maybe multifamily buildings, in complex relationships between tenants and landlords, and for the most vulnerable households in our society. So we need to be very careful, I think, about the design of the standards. And by design, I mean the design of the standard itself in terms of which buildings we target and the timelines we use and the triggers we use, but also the much wider framework within which the standards sit. So the funding, the practical help, the careful monitoring and safeguards that I'm really pleased to have heard Serena mention there. And so these are the things that we need to make sure that the trigger of the standard or the communication tool of the standard leads to a successful renovation. So if I can just put a little bit more flesh on some of the bones of the things that I think are really important there. Starting with the design of the standard itself, I think it is clear that standards need to apply to all buildings. First of all, because all buildings need to get onto this decarbonisation pathway. We are very behind in decarbonisation in the building sector. And we see examples of minimum energy performance standards being used across the world or in all the different sectors of buildings. So we know that they're relevant, they can be used for the sectors. Importantly, within the housing sector, though, I think we do need to be careful not to create distortions in the stock of in the housing stock by application of standards to one sector or one part of the stock and not others. So, for example, if we were to set a really ambitious standard for the privately rented housing that didn't apply to other areas of the stock, this may lead to privately rented housing being sold into the owner-occupied sector and leaving us with a shortage of privately rented homes. And so I think those kinds of things are the considerations we need to really be thinking of when we're setting a standard. It needs to be ambitious, it needs to be sensitive. I think part of that sensitivity is around timelines. We are clear that MEPs should be a backstop. They are and a communication tool, so need to be announced early, giving householders, building owners enough time to access the support they need to renovate, to get the renovations done with clarity of what is expected of their building. I think we need to also be sensitive for some building types. This is going to be a bit more complex, and they may need more time. I'm particularly thinking about multifamily buildings here, where lots and lots of different unit owners might need to come together to make joint decisions, and that does take more time. So I think there's sensitivities around design that we absolutely need to be aware of. I think the wider framework, however, is actually harder. I think that we need a lot more focus than we've had to date in MEPs on looking at this wider renovation framework. And I think this is one way in which we need to start looking beyond the EPBD to actually the wider Fit455 framework and looking at the rest of the package and how that all comes together to support the achievement of these successful and ambitious renovations. 3 elements I'll cover here. I think the framework goes beyond these, but so I don't speak forever. The 3 elements, first and foremost, funding and finance, funding and finance, funding and finance. Particularly for low-income households, we need to be very aware that many of these households will need up to 100% subsidy, 100% funding. And we can't underestimate how much a big change that will be in the prioritization and the use of our public money. So far in renovation, the vast majority of public money has gone towards incentivizing renovations in those households where people can contribute to the cost. It's a market-based sort of approach. But our public funds are so valuable, and the needs in the low-income households are so great that actually I think we really do need to think about how we prioritize the use of those very, very valuable public funds for the sources that really need them most, and for where private sector finance really will be not as appropriate. So I think we also need to think about, so in thinking about this, I think this is where we need to think very strategically across the whole Fit455 package, where we can see specific links, I think, across to the Energy Efficiency Directive and a new ring fence within the main energy efficiency target within that. We're seeing a new ring fence being introduced to prioritise action in low-income households, which is very important. Is it enough? Will that ring fence drive enough action proportionally to the number of households in the stock? I'm not so sure, but it's a good indication of how I think we need to be looking for all of these opportunities to start bringing more and more of our, particularly our public support towards the most vulnerable households. Social Climate Fund is another place. I am less confident about how much of this could be used or will be used for renovation. I feel the fund at the moment is focused on addressing the distributional impact, so addressing the extra burden created by a carbon price. And will the fund be enough to do that effectively as well as drive renovations? I'm not so sure. But I think these are the things that we need to be looking at to look at where we can kind of push harder. Funding and finance also needs to be appropriate. And I think this was already said by Serena, and just to add a little bit more detail, they're particularly appropriate for complex situations. So for landlords and tenants and for multifamily buildings. We need to ensure funding and finance is available for landlords, but it's also geared to allow fair sharing of the costs between the landlord, the tenant and the state, where state support is needed. Within that, I really 100% think we need to move away from this idea that the renovation cost can be paid off through bills. The depth of renovations we need to get to full decarbonisation, the costs are too great to expect those to be paid off through bills. So we need mechanisms to make sure that rents and energy bills don't become unaffordable as a result of these renovation costs. So, I mean, there's a lot more to be said on funding and finance, and I think this is really the priority area for me. Additionally, though, and also very important, is practical support. So a lot of progress, I think, being made on one-stop shops, and I think that's absolutely wonderful. They need to be local, but they also need to be tailored. So we need to have the right support in there for the variety of different households and landlords that will need to go through the renovation processes. So services that are appropriate for landlords and tenants each and together, and services that are also suitable for the most vulnerable in our society, who will have different barriers that they face to renovation. And then finally, just to pick up on the point of monitoring and safeguards, I think when we think about minimum energy performance standards, we think about them as increasing the performance of the stock. So it's natural to think that we would monitor at a national level or a local level the increase in the performance of the stock or the decarbonisation of the stock, but we mustn't also forget to be monitoring and looking at the impacts on our households and communities. So to make sure that renovations actually contribute to housing security and don't challenge it. And as I've said, I think, getting all of those pieces and the further pieces that are needed of that framework outside of the design of the regulation itself is very difficult. It is something that we shouldn't shy away from, however, if we are introducing these minimum energy performance standards. It's also a challenge that I don't think we can leave entirely to member states. We need to make sure that the European framework is pulling as hard as it can to help member states get into the right place. There will be a lot of work to do in member states, but I don't think that framework can be entirely left to member states to deliver, particularly if the requirement to regulate has been set at European level. So I'll leave it there. I would just say actually that I know that this week the Right to Energy Coalition, who's a really leading voice on energy poverty in Europe, has released a briefing just this week on Monday on this subject. So I would recommend to go and have a look at that for a bit more detail than I'm able to give in this talk.
Thank you, Louise. That was amazingly comprehensive for such a short time. And I think gives us a lot to come back to in the discussion afterwards. Emmanuel, could I hand over to you and hear how this looks from a landlord's perspective?
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Serena and Louise, for this introduction. Yes, as many of you know, our association represents private owners, so we represent homeowners, small landlord, and sometimes also larger real estate companies. But the big part of the members will be homeowners and small landlords. I'm also invited to speak today on behalf of the European Housing Forum. We issued a letter, a couple of weeks ago as well on the Fitfor55. The European Housing Forum is a kind of informal body where all housing stakeholders, or many of the housing stakeholders here in Brussels, meet on a regular basis to address or to discuss housing related issues. And we felt the need to have a common statement on the Fitfor55 package. And when I was looking at, if you allow a step back, and when I was looking at today's title, will the Fitfor55 package make the housing crisis better or worse? And to be honest, I don't know. And I'm not able to answer this question. And I hardly doubt that any of us here in this room today is able to answer that. And that's really what worries me, because we lack data in Europe. We know that. We lack clear data on our stocks. So that's already one crucial aspect. Without that, we cannot assess the impact of all these measures. And then, of course, the Fitfor55 package was there to address the climate challenge, and is a good thing. And we'll have positive, I think, social and economic impact. And again, is a good thing. But at the same time, some of the measures will be good for all citizens, some like better insulated house, lower energy used, and probably better health and quality, and maybe even safety. But at the same time, we have the package is so huge, but it's very hard to have a full overview of what will impact the housing sector. And I think when we tried to discuss among us and list everything that will impact housing and European households, it's very difficult. I think Serena mentioned some of this, but there will be lots of requirement and impactful measures, such as higher energy costs with the ETS and the Energy Taxation Directive. There is a MEPS, minimum energy performance requirement you mentioned, Louise, and I will come back to that in a minute. The 3% obligation to renovate public building to nearly zero energy or even zero energy building level, but will also apply to social housing, and how this will impact as well the building of new social housing is also a question that the social housing sector is trying to address. There is, of course, the new requirement for NZEP now with nearly zero energy building. So how this will impact the cost of new building. There is a requirement for renewable, the overall target, but also the requirement at building level. There is all these certification and communication tools, such as the EPC, the building renovation passport, even the SRI, the smart readiness indicator, all this coming together, all this add to the cost, and we don't know yet what would be the impact of that. So it's very difficult for me to answer this question. And all this, of course, come on top of every national and local and regulation on housing, on taxation, etc. So we don't have a full picture. And there is indeed a risk that this has an impact on more pressing issues such as the housing crisis. So we really need to pay attention to that. And if I go more into details maybe of the current or upcoming directive, because I think what's most relevant for us here today is really the energy performance of building directives. And these MEPs that Louise widely or extensively mentioned, which in my view will be the most impactful measure of the directive, and probably one of the most impactful measure on the housing sector ever coming from the EU level. And this will inevitably generate lots of changes, I think, and some will be positive and some will be negative. And it's, in my view, again, very early to tell. And I discussed that with some of you already. Even in the UK, which already has some kind of maps in place for a couple of years, we don't have yet a full extensive overview of the impact of the measure in the past years. And in France, it's too early again to tell, because I think the first cut-off dates are coming in a couple of years. But we see some impact. And last week there was a study from Sologer, which is one of the main platforms in France for online platform for selling and renting, and they found out that this year compared to last year there was a huge increase of sale of what they call passoire énergétique, or huge increase of passoire énergétique on the market, meaning the worst performing buildings. And this is quite significant in most big cities in France. And this could be seen as positive, because meaning that there are more houses on the market, so maybe the accession to property might be easier, but at the same time it means that you might reduce the offer of rental property on the market, and this is something that we really need to pay attention. It doesn't mean that this study is like a clear sign, but still I think it's kind of show that some of the trend we were expecting and we were worrying about might become true. So that's very important to look at that. Then I was taking notes now also on the impact of the MEPs, and this is also something Louise mentioned, but this is even more true at EU level. The impact will be far from being universal across member states, across sector, between housing and different sectors. Housing need to be addressed with special care. Between property archetype as well, and the national and local markets. There will be greater consequences in poorest country, where the stock is in bad conditions, and when the average income is 500 to 600 euro. We shouldn't forget that, but there are countries in Europe, and these are not poor households, they are just medium average income in their countries, and this earn less than 1,000 euro a month. So So that's an important aspect. And as well, I will invite you to look at a study that was published 2 weeks ago in the UK, also on the impact of renovation obligation according to the local market. If a local market, the property sale of worth 90,000 euro, if you have to do 24,000 euro, which is the average they estimate to reach a C grade, that's mean a huge percentage of the value of your property. And it's very different if you have a property in London and you have to make the same investment. There it's only 1% of the value of your property. So all in all, these are important elements. And I think what we were very careful on when we were talking about MEPs and what we were really calling on, and this, I'm not sure what the Commission is going to go for, but we were really asking for this careful assessment of the stock and really trying to have a proper, full, in-depth analysis of where we stand and where we want to go. And we'll be careful and look at the impact assessment, to which extent this is addressed. To have this member state flexibility between the one who can go faster and the one who need more time. I think it's very important. Also these gradual introductions, and this is also mentioned by Louise, we need time to finance before, we need time to prepare the market, we need time to have a professional in place. We have to avoid these bottlenecks. If you go too quickly with the cutoff dates, you will have huge bottlenecks. You will have not enough professional in place, everyone will try to renovate at the same time, the cost of material will go up, etc. So all this will have an impact on the overall cost of renovation. So that's very important. We were also hoping for a sectoral approach. I hear what you say, Louise, about the fact that you cannot address one specific sector to the other because you might have unwished consequences moving from one sector to the other. But still, we were hoping that housing could have been dealt with special care, once again, and a specific safeguard as well. And of course, this incentivize first, train first, inform first, and support the owners and the tenants to do the transition. It's very important. And again, that's why we need time. We need to be careful, especially with these maps, how we will, the timeline we will set and the speed we will set. I think it's a critical aspect here. And I'm not going to go into the funding now. We can discuss that later. But obviously, and even if you talk about the social climate fund, even if you address only the vulnerable, it's far too little. We know that. And at member state level as well, there is a limited amount of funding available. So, and on top of that, it's not only, and it's great to focus on the vulnerable, but you have lots of middle income people who are struggling, and they are just at the age of, and we see that now with the increase of energy prices, that their situation is becoming more and more difficult for them, and we need to find specific, we need to find a way to address, I think, a wide part of this housing sector, not only the most vulnerable, and but also these middle income households. So, happy to discuss further and come back to this in a minute. But it's just a kind of statement I wanted to make, just listening to what you've been saying so far.
Okay, thank you very much, Emmanuel. I think a very considered and convincing case for caution and for being really sensitive to the specificities of the housing segment of the building stock. I would like to hand over now to Sarah. Please, Sarah.
Merci Ruth, merci pour cette intervention, Emmanuel et Louise pour votre intervention avant moi. Donc pour information, la Fondation Abbé Pierre, c'est une fondation qui œuvre en France pour le logement des personnes défavorisées.
Trying to provide or to improve the situation of poorly accommodated people.
Dont on parle aujourd'hui et qui sont visés par le pack Fit for 55, qui vont subir d'une certaine manière, enfin en tout cas, qui vont devoir vivre avec ces mesures qui sont prises au niveau européen, puis ensuite au niveau national. Qu'est-ce que je voulais apporter au débat? C'était ce qu'est la précarité énergétique, parce qu'on a parlé beaucoup de techniques, aussi de ce que cela implique de rénover les bâtiments, mais on a peu parlé finalement des conditions de vie des gens et de ce que cela pouvait apporter de rénover les bâtiments et comment on pouvait le faire pour viser ceux qui finalement vivent dans des conditions les plus difficiles et ceux qui ont des revenus les plus modestes. Alors, qu'est-ce que c'est la précarité énergétique? La précarité énergétique, c'est le fait de ne pas pouvoir maintenir une température adéquate dans son logement, soit du fait de ses revenus, soit du fait de l'habitat. En tout cas, c'est comme ça qu'en France, on définit la précarité énergétique. Je sais qu'il y a des échanges et des débats qui peuvent être menés parmi les experts, mais en tout cas, ce sont des critères qu'on peut retrouver un petit peu dans les définitions. Or, ces conditions, cette problématique, elle arrive dans un contexte où on a en Europe environ 72 millions de personnes qui vivent sous le seuil de pauvreté. Le contexte du logement, et Emmanuel en a parlé, est particulièrement difficile depuis plusieurs années. On a 10% de ménages qui ont des taux d'effort excessifs pour régler leurs charges, leur loyer, leurs prêts, etc., en lien avec le logement. Et 4% d'entre eux, des ménages qui vivent dans des logements inadéquats, c'est-à-dire ce que nous, on appelle en France le logement indigne, l'habitat indigne, c'est-à-dire qui ne répondent pas à des normes de confort et d'habitabilité minimum. Donc, qu'est-ce que ça implique la précarité énergétique pour 50 millions d'Européens aujourd'hui? Ça implique des conséquences importantes sur les charges qu'ils mettent pour leur logement. Donc, avec ce que ça peut engager comme au pire, avec des impayés, au bout de la chaîne aussi, si on veut voir les scénarios un peu catastrophiques, des expulsions aussi, hein, des expulsions de leur logement. Ça a des implications aussi sur leur santé, avec des risques de pathologies respiratoires, ostéo-articulaires, des problèmes neurologiques, et aussi, et on en a beaucoup parlé pendant la crise du Covid, des risques sur la santé mentale, avec voilà, de l'isolement, des difficultés à vivre correctement et confortablement dans son logement au quotidien. Et tout ça, alors donc cette crise du logement, mais aussi un contexte de hausse, et on en a un peu parlé, des prix de l'énergie qui ne va pas s'arrêter demain et pour lesquels on va avoir des réponses à apporter à ces ménages en difficulté. Donc, quel est l'impératif aujourd'hui? Il est impératif que la législation qui concerne la performance énergétique des bâtiments et qui concerne l'efficacité énergétique ait en tête ce contexte important social. Parce que la transition énergétique ne se fera pas sans une transition sociale qui non seulement tient compte des plus vulnérables, mais aussi qui les protège des conséquences, des mesures qui peuvent être prises pour pouvoir agir contre le climat. Pour le climat, pardon. Il y a quelques jours, on a rencontré la ministre de la Transition écologique en France qui nous disait une chose importante et je crois que je vais faire mienne cette idée, la question de l'acceptabilité des mesures. L'acceptabilité des mesures, c'est la possibilité d'entraîner par devant les politiques l'ensemble des citoyens européens au travers des États membres. L'ensemble des citoyens, ça veut dire aussi les plus vulnérables. Ça veut dire aussi le secteur du bâtiment, ça veut dire aussi tout le secteur économique autour de ces mesures. Donc, comment faire en sorte que pour à la fois que les mesures pour le climat restent intéressantes pour les personnes, en tout cas entendables pour les personnes, mais aussi pour que l'Europe envoie auprès de ces ménages un message qui dit qu'elle est capable de les entendre et d'entendre leurs préoccupations quotidiennes. Parce que leurs préoccupations quotidiennes, c'est pouvoir vivre décemment de leur travail, vivre dans des logements corrects, faire en sorte que leur enfant ait accès à l'éducation et pouvoir se déplacer sans y laisser la moitié de leur salaire. Donc, comment faire en sorte de ça à travers ces nouvelles normes qui vont arriver avec le pacte Fitfor55, pardon. Selon nous, et Louise en a un petit peu parlé, et donc je le reprends un petit peu à mon compte, mais je ne vais pas rentrer dans le détail parce que je pense qu'elle le faisait beaucoup mieux que moi, c'est l'impératif, alors évidemment d'avoir des standards minimums de rénovation, d'avoir des obligations de rénover, mais en priorité les passoires énergétiques. Et ça nécessite, et Louise l'a dit, de savoir de quoi on parle quand on parle des passoires énergétiques. Ça nécessite de savoir quel est l'état du parc. Et là, c'est ce qu'Emmanuel disait, il nous faut des données, il nous faut une photographie des besoins et de la façon dont on va répondre à ces besoins. Effectivement, les pays qui sont plus pauvres, dont les revenus sont plus bas en Europe, ne vont pas avoir les mêmes problématiques de rénovation que des pays, par exemple, au nord de l'Europe, qui ont déjà engagé une transition énergétique importante et pour lesquels, certainement, le coût social sera moins important. Donc, dans les mesures importantes, il y a cette question de rénover, les standards minimums, mais ça ne peut pas suffire. Il faut aussi, et je l'ai dit tout à l'heure, protéger les ménages les plus modestes, notamment, alors évidemment, en touchant, enfin, en rénovant le parc social. Ça, je pense qu'il y a quand même des choses qui ont déjà été engagées, notamment sur le précédent exercice avec les fonds structurels qui ont déjà, en tout cas en France, où le parc social est important, déjà lancé un petit peu une dynamique dans ce secteur-là pour la rénovation. Mais aussi, évidemment, le parc privé, notamment, je pense aux ménages les plus modestes, les propriétaires occupants, mais aussi, et là, on sait qu'il y a des difficultés à atteindre ces publics-là, le parc locatif, c'est-à-dire comment faire en sorte que la rénovation qui incombe aux propriétaires bailleurs et qui bénéficiera in fine d'une certaine manière plutôt à l'occupant, puisse se faire malgré cette dissension-là entre les intérêts des uns et des autres. Donc évidemment, ça nécessite de financer, et on l'a dit, Louise l'a dit, Emmanuel l'a dit, de financer largement. En France, où le gouvernement affiche plutôt une politique volontariste dans ce domaine, néanmoins, les budgets sont largement en deçà de ce que plusieurs organismes ont pointé du doigt pour pouvoir atteindre les objectifs qu'on s'est fixés. On parle de 13 milliards d'euros par an pour ce qui est du Haut Comité pour le climat en France. Je crois qu'on est entre 15 et 25 milliards pour ce qui est d'une enquête parlementaire. Donc, vous voyez qu'on est bien en deçà de ce qui se fait pour l'instant. Ça nécessite de viser des classes énergétiques hautes, parce que forcément, hein, quand on part de très bas, si on est juste sur une amélioration au pourcentage, on n'atteint pas des performances qui soient satisfaisantes et sur le plan climatique et sur le plan social. Et puis, ça nécessite évidemment, pour les plus modestes, un reste à charge proche de zéro. Donc, c'est-à-dire, et Louise l'a dit, un subventionnement à 100% lorsque c'est nécessaire pour les ménages les plus modestes, pour les propriétaires les plus modestes, évidemment, qu'ils soient bailleurs ou qu'ils soient propriétaires, avec peut-être des aménagements pour les uns et pour les autres. Pour cela, il faut que les fonds qui pourtant existent déjà assez largement dans les États, en tout cas en France, on peut dire que même si c'est insuffisant, il y a quand même plusieurs fonds qui sont disponibles. L'Union européenne aussi a mis un ensemble de packages financiers pour essayer de financer sa vague de rénovation. Mais les financements ne redescendront pas sur les territoires sans un accompagnement adéquat des propriétaires et des personnes en charge de la rénovation. Ça nécessite des guichets uniques installés très localement, c'est-à-dire vraiment à proximité des personnes, qui soient obligatoires dès lors qu'on est sur des rénovations importantes et qui vraiment accompagnent les ménages depuis même la durée de vie, si j'ose dire, du bâtiment, donc en passant par l'audit, le montage financier, l'assistance aux travaux, l'assistance à la maîtrise d'ouvrage pour les travaux, le choix des entreprises, le suivi des travaux, le contrôle des travaux, mais aussi la mesure de la performance énergétique tout au long de la vie du bâtiment, avant et après les travaux. Voilà, je crois que la question de la communication aussi est importante, on en a parlé. Et j'ajoute à ça qu'au-delà de cette question de la rénovation, s'oppose évidemment la question de l'impact sur les marchés. Emmanuel en a parlé. Et on a beaucoup œuvré à la Fondation Abbé Pierre pour que les marchés, notamment le marché des marchés locatifs, soient protégés d'une évolution qui ne leur serait pas favorable. C'est-à-dire la possibilité de geler les loyers lorsqu'il y a des rénovations. On voit par exemple qu'en Allemagne, les propriétaires qui effectuent des rénovations ont la possibilité d'augmenter les loyers de 8%, ce qui est énorme et ce qui participe d'un sentiment d'injustice vis-à-vis de ces rénovations. Ça participe aussi de phénomènes de gentrification des territoires et dans les zones tendues, très tendues, que sont les métropoles européennes qui subissent déjà une pression énorme pour permettre aux résidents de se loger là où ils travaillent, là où ils vivent, là où leurs enfants vont à l'école, évidemment que ça ne sera pas acceptable à terme. Donc, je crois qu'il y a aussi toute cette question de l'encadrement des loyers, de l'impossibilité de mettre fin au contrat locatif dans les années qui suivent les rénovations pour éviter des phénomènes importants de gentrification des villes. Voilà, je crois que j'ai à peu près fait le tour. J'espère que j'oublierai rien, mais je compléterai au cours du débat. J'espère que je n'ai pas été trop longue. Merci.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sarah. So I think that there was a huge amount that came out from those 4 interventions. Some debate and some contrasting perspectives. Some kind of technical issues relating to the most important directives and especially this question of mandatory energy performance standards for which parts of the stock with what deadlines and what performance levels, but also sort of more horizontal questions around monitoring, social safeguards, how the whole Fit455 package fits together, and probably most importantly, how all of this gets paid for and by whom. So I think I have a few questions that I'd like to come back to speakers with. There are a couple of questions already in the chat, and I would like to encourage the participants to raise any questions that you have, and also don't hesitate to direct a question to a particular speaker. Perhaps just to go into a second round with the panelists, it might be interesting to zoom in on this question that Sarah raised about okay, we should target the worst performing buildings and people in vulnerable situations, but we have to know who they are and what we're talking about. Perhaps I could invite maybe first Serena and then the other panelists as they wish to come in on that and to say, you know, what should the definition of worst performing buildings look like? Should it be done at European level? Should it be done at member state level? And who are we really talking about when we're talking about these vulnerable customers?
Thank you, Ruth. I'm happy to kickstart to the reply to this question, and thank you also for the other panelists for the very relevant points and interesting comments made. On this point on who, I mean, knowing who we should target really and how we can define worst performing buildings, some points. Also in relation to what Emmanuel has said earlier, that there is perhaps a lack of data and really good overview of buildings. On that angle, I think we have improved really a lot in the last years. We know much more about buildings across the EU. We have much more information about rented buildings and sales. Really, I think that there was already some improvement, but I totally agree with you that we can do much more. But at the same time, I'm also absolutely sure that we cannot wait to act to have the perfect picture on everything. We should also try to do the best with the information that we have, and have mechanisms in place to adjust over time, also based on the evidence that comes out, and of course unintended consequences. We should be cautious there, because indeed when there is not the perfect picture, we should also we cannot anticipate everything, but there is a balance to be found there. On the worst performing buildings, I think we have really tools that can help in that sense, in identifying which are the buildings which are worst placed. We have a framework at EU level already existing of energy performance certificates working by classes. It's really in the goals of the revision of the PPD to strengthen these tools, also to make it more operational for building owners, but also for occupiers of building. And we see a lot of potential of making these tools really the center of information for buildings, but at the same time also this certificate comes at a cost, so we also have to be mindful of affordability also in that sense. But if we want to make things simple, worst performing buildings are the ones in the lowest energy class, based on that framework. And I think it's interesting because in the long-term renovation strategies, we have in the framework that we have now, we have encouraged member states to identify worst performing buildings and to target those buildings with the national policies. So from the assessment of the LTRS, we also have useful information backing the fact that member states also used the energy class in that sense, also with other criteria. And as you know, we have already assessed a first batch of long-term renovation strategies, and very soon we are going to issue a more comprehensive assessment of the full package of national strategies, which in that sense you will see is extremely rich in terms of data and information, to come back to the point that I made earlier. On knowing who are the vulnerable citizens in the vulnerable households, I think on this, in the Social Climate Fund proposal, it is proposed, I think, a planned-based approach, so that member states will have to identify whom to target, who would have to be the recipient of these funds. And because indeed that's the level that is closer really to the issues, to the problem, but at the same time we also have recommendations on energy poverty that also identify which are the indicators to take into account. So I think on that sense there are some indications from these instruments. Perhaps the last reaction from my side, I've seen the question in the chat about the use of ERTF fund specifically for renovation of private buildings. It's a technical questions that
bâtiment privé. Alors là, c'est une question technique, je ne peux pas y répondre maintenant. Mais si la personne qui a mis ce commentaire ou cette question dans la fin de la discussion pouvait également mettre son adresse courriel, je poserai la question à mes collègues et je relayerai la réponse.
Okay, thank you, Serena. I'll hand over to Sarah, but I just take the opportunity to welcome Philippe Pelletier, who has joined us and is one of the speakers in our second panel. So welcome, Sarah. Sarah, did you raise your hand? Yeah, please go ahead.
Oui, je voulais répondre à la question sur le FEDER. Je crois que le FEDER prévoit au niveau européen la possibilité de rénover le parc privé. En tout cas, rien ne s'y oppose, mais tout dépend de si les régions où se trouve l'immeuble ont inscrit dans leur programmation opérationnelle la possibilité, le projet d'utiliser le FEDER à cette fin. Et c'est un vrai problème, c'est une vraie question, parce que pour l'heure, ce n'est pas obligatoire. Et donc, on a de grandes disparités territoriales sur ces questions-là. Aujourd'hui, il y a une priorité, qu'elle soit européenne ou en France, en tout cas nationale, pour rénover le parc dans des délais relativement courts. Et donc, peut-être qu'il aurait été important aussi d'appuyer la priorité de l'utilisation du FEDER sur ces sujets.
Thank you. Louise or Emmanuel, would you like to come in on this question? Not the one about the funds, the one about worst performing buildings and vulnerable consumers.
Bonjour, Monsieur Pelletier. No, I think basically I would agree with Serena. I think she said everything on that, at least from an EU perspective. So I think the EPC and the actual guidelines on how to define energy poverty, I think, are useful and probably would be enough at EU level. The question is, again, for me, the question will be the pace of this renovation and the depth of the renovation. So I'm happy to come back to that later on and maybe move to the next question.
Thanks. Louise?
If I may, just two really small things to say. I think I agree with what has been said about routes to defining worst performing. I think we should just really remind ourselves, though, that we start with the worst performing, we don't end there. And I think this is a very key opportunity to, yes, start with the worst performing, but the communication opportunities, so the renovation opportunities, start from that point for the whole stock. I think that's a really important point. I do pick up Sarah's point as well about how do we define and how do we find those lowest income, those most vulnerable. And I think this is always the challenge in setting energy poverty definitions or setting eligibility criteria for support, is that there are some people who fall in and some people who fall out. So some people who are in need, but they are not eligible for whatever reasons around the way that we've had to practically set these eligibility criteria. So that is always a challenge, and I think probably a bigger challenge than the one of defining the worst performing stock. And I think the ideal, and I mean, Emmanuel, you brought up this point, didn't you? I think the ideal obviously is that we have funding and finance packages that are suitable for the full range of experiences, from the lowest income through middle income, people who are struggling, and then up to those who are more able to pay. But that's a big design program of funding and finance to make that happen.
Thank you. So there's another question in the chat which relates to an idea from Zaha's intervention about social transition, and she wonders whether there is a list of points or recommendations that could be taken into account for public authorities and cities especially to deliver and design a social transition.
Je crois que cette question était pour moi. J'en profite pour parler aussi de la façon dont on identifie les personnes vulnérables. Je crois que déjà le niveau de revenu et les personnes sous un risque de pauvreté ou vivant en dessous du seuil de pauvreté, c'est déjà un bon début. Et si on a réussi au moins dans un premier temps ou de façon concomitante à couvrir l'ensemble de ces personnes-là, on aura déjà fait un grand pas vers la transition sociale. Et donc, pour répondre à la question de Laura Coligny sur le rôle des villes, je crois que les villes sont celles qui sont au plus près des personnes et qui ont une capacité à identifier le plus précisément les besoins sur leur territoire et les réponses qui peuvent y être apportées. Et c'est important qu'elles aient une marge de manœuvre, qu'il y ait une flexibilité dans les législations pour qu'elles puissent, elles aussi, se saisir des outils existants pour pouvoir aider les personnes sur leur territoire. Je pense par exemple à la question de la création des guichets uniques. Évidemment, les villes auront un rôle à jouer. Je pense aussi à la question des financements. Enfin, je pense par exemple à la ville de Paris qui peut être amenée à faire des aides complémentaires pour les ménages vulnérables résidant sur son territoire, en plus des aides d'État existantes, etc. Donc, bien sûr, les villes ont un rôle à jouer évident et elles ont, en tout cas sur la question du logement, elles sont déjà en première ligne.
Thank you. There is another question in the chat which is about the fact that probably many of the worst performing buildings in Europe are lying empty or vacant. And do the panelists have thoughts about how to prioritize those or whether we should prioritize those? I mean, obviously from a housing exclusion perspective, vacant property that could be brought into use to respond to housing need is a really important topic. Emmanuel?
Oui, j'ai presque envie de parler en français après écouter Sarah, ça me change un petit peu, donc je vais peut-être switcher en français maintenant. Non, je trouve que c'est une question très intéressante parce que le problème de la vacance, de la propriété, c'est une question très complexe en fait. Il y a beaucoup de raisons pour qu'une propriété soit vacante et c'est pas toujours évident à définir. Et c'est vrai qu'il y a pas mal de propriétés qui sont vacantes parce qu'elles sont soit dans les mains de personnes très âgées qui ne savent plus quoi en faire, soit dans des mains de gens qui en ont hérité, des propriétés en très mauvais état, dont ils ne savent pas quoi faire. Donc là, il y a vraiment un intérêt, et là, c'est là où j'aime, de mon point de vue personnel, en tout cas, je trouve que c'est très important de travailler avec des associations comme Fianza et la Fondation Abbé Pierre. C'est que nous, on essaye de promouvoir les social rented agencies, social rental agencies, donc les agences immobilières sociales, c'est ça la traduction en français. Et là, je pense qu'il y a vraiment...
AIVS, agence immobilière à vocation sociale.
Voilà, donc la définition exacte, merci. Et donc ça, c'est vraiment... peut-être, comme je dis souvent, une niche, mais c'est quand même un secteur qu'il faut développer parce qu'il y a vraiment un besoin d'aider ces propriétaires qui sont un peu perdus, qui ne savent pas quoi faire de leur propriété et qui ont besoin d'un soutien où là, vraiment, l'intermédiaire, l'agence immobilière sociale, peut prendre en main la propriété, peut faire qu'elle soit rénovée et peut la mettre en location à des prix abordables avec un loyer social. Et ça, vraiment, c'est un secteur qu'il faut développer. Ça existe dans pas mal de pays, mais ça reste très limité et je pense qu'il faut vraiment travailler là-dessus. Et ça peut aider aussi à faire en sorte que le secteur du bâtiment, qui est déjà plus de propriété à la location, mais qui est aussi un secteur du bâtiment plus performant. Voilà, donc j'étais contente de pouvoir parler en français. Merci.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Would anyone else like to come in on that question of vacant housing?
Just if I may, sorry, I won't be speaking French. Nobody wants me to do that. It's dreadful. But I think exactly just to really reinforce what Emmanuel just said, I have seen in some national regulations sort of exemptions from these kinds of standards for buildings that are not occupied for more than a couple of months a year. I think those exemptions are directed at sort of holiday rentals, holiday apartments, but actually I think they could then obviously extend, and I think actually this is a much more productive, practical and ambitious proposal that Emmanuel is making. I think rather than exemptions for the difficult parts of the stock, we should really be looking at these very innovative models like the social rental agencies for the solutions rather than exemptions.
Thank you, Louise. There is a question from Ivan Tosh from the Metropolitan Research Institute in Hungary, which I think goes to the heart of some of what we've been hearing today about how this works as a whole package, and also about the balance in terms of responsibility at European level and competence at a European level, and implementation at a member state level. And so the question is, well, it's the Energy Savings Directive, but the Fit for 55 legislative package will make some of these standards compulsory, while the design of the social assistance or the social safeguards is in the hands of the member states. So what happens if some countries and cities and poor parts of the housing stock are neglected? What can and will the EU do? Is the question clear?
Yes. Maybe.
Okay, Serena, perhaps you could.
I think it is a very good question, and it refers to the balance that I mentioned before. So the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive is a directive, is not a regulation. So in any case, is then the implementation and adaptation to national situation is left to the member state, but with a clear framework. And then so this is true, and I mean, it will depend a bit on how the different instruments will be designed in DPBD. We currently have already in DPBD, and it works well to have a framework at EU level that then is applied and made it work to the different specificity of member states. It works for the minimum requirements for major renovations, for technical building system, for new buildings. So this already happens, and it works. Then the combination with the targeting of the specific problematic issues that requires more attention, also from the point of view of the social dimension. I think I'm talking just specifically about the proposal for the Social Climate Fund, but I think there are other tools like the Just Transition Fund that really have this in mind. So there is a framework, but then the specific targeting is left to the member states, where there is more knowledge on where the problems are, with the goal not to leave anyone behind. But indeed, I mean, it's really, I think, one of the core of the issues here to have the good balance and the good complementarities there.
Okay, thank you. I think Louise and then Emmanuel, perhaps.
Thank you. I think it's an excellent question. I think it's one that we really are grappling with. The more ambitious that we have to be, and therefore we are, the more burdensome, some of these European centrally agreed policies, directives, targets, aims, and ambitions are. So, so I think that the more ambitious we are, the more that it throws a light on this question. I would just say, though, that I think Fit for 55 is actually addressing this question much more than we've addressed it before. I think, to use the example of the ETS one, the emissions trading scheme we have already in place, that is a scheme that adds a carbon price that people pay through their electricity bills. There is to date, until this latest package, there has been no firm requirement on member states to use the revenues from that fund to reimburse households for that cost, particularly not to reimburse households for the cost when they are lowest income, and therefore the burden of that cost is greatest. There has not even been a very firm requirement to use those revenues for carbon purposes. It's just been a gentle suggestion question. and this is something I think, you know, we've criticised a bit the Social Climate Fund, but I think we are at least in Fit for 55 with the talking about extending the ETS to a new sector, two new sectors, that we are actually recognising that those revenues need to be used for redistribution and for the purpose of the carbon price, which is to save carbon and accelerate decarbonisation. So I think there are a number of places. I've already mentioned the Energy Efficiency Directive as well, where we're introducing a ring fence within the energy savings target. I think this package is trying a lot harder than we have done. That isn't to say that I don't still think this is an absolute key question, and to try and get that right, you know, is absolutely key. I would say, as I've said before, that I think that the more that the European, the jointly agreed package can really place a focus on lower income households, where we haven't really had that focus so much before, particularly in ring fencing, financing and funding for those households, then I think that's it's the direction that package can set, that then hopefully member states can follow, and the more funding and finance that is structured that way, then, you know, naturally obviously would filter down to be spent that way. But I just to say, I think it is a really good question.
Emmanuel.
I will answer your question in a second, but just on the ETS part, I think there are also questions from the sector saying part of the ETS, the part of the ETS that will be used by member state is not so strictly ring fenced. And we see that, for example, part of it that you will income from ETS will get, member state will get for buildings and transport, they can use it for deforestation, for example, and this shouldn't be the case. We as a sector believe everything that comes from the building sector and transport sector should be reused in the building and transport sector, and this is, I think, one of the things that we consider kind of problematic now, because of the social impact of the ETS. We should make sure that this is reinvested in not only in mitigating the impact of increasing the energy costs, but also reinvested in increasing renovation rates. So that's one very important aspect. And the second aspect, I think the question that was asked is very, very important. And this is what I mean when I say we need to be careful when we tackle the housing sector, because lots of competencies in the sector go well beyond what the EU can do. And you mentioned that, Sarah. I wouldn't necessarily agree with you on the rent control and the rent freeze, because I think there is a limit to what you can impose, especially if you want to increase the rate of deep renovation. I agree with you that there is a huge risk when you renovate of what you call renoviction and gentrification. But at the same time, I think this will be for member state to find the right balance in between what is needed in terms of renovation and what you can do in order to protect the tenants. And this is a national matter, and sometimes it's even a regional matter, depending on the member state. And this is where I think we need to be careful at EU level on what we impose, because we do not necessarily have a tool here in Brussels, basically, to mitigate the impact. So we can impose things, but we cannot mitigate the impact. We can impose things, but we cannot necessarily incentivize. It's another very important question is taxation, for example. Taxation, we all know that it's a very good tool to promote renovation, but taxation is mainly, not only exclusively, VAT is an exception, but the taxation is mainly a national tool as well. So here again, we can there are things we can do at EU level, but we cannot necessarily have the entire, let's say, package that will help us to make sure that what we aim at, what we impose, what we tend to foster will be accompanied by the right and the appropriate tool at national and local level. And I think this is why, I mean, we need to be careful taking this into account. So that will be my point on this question, but very good point. I completely agree.
Thank you. We are running out of time a little bit on our panel. I'd like to give Sarah the chance to come in on this. And also there is a question, and I might invite any speakers if they feel able to follow it up in the chat, or let me know if you think you can answer it quickly, which is how could we ensure that Fit for 55 doesn't disproportionately affect women? For example, because they tend to rent more often. So I'll give you a minute to think about that and give the floor to Sarah.
Oui, pour conclure, je pense qu'il est important pour nous, en tout cas à la Fondation Abbé Pierre, de rappeler ce que j'ai dit tout à l'heure, c'est-à-dire de faire attention de protéger les plus vulnérables, des mesures qui seraient prises au niveau européen, à la fois pour des raisons sociales que j'ai déjà évoquées, mais aussi pour des raisons politiques, puisque, comme vous le savez, l'impact d'une augmentation des coûts d'énergie pourrait avoir des conséquences politiques et sociales importantes, comme ça a été le cas en France avec les Gilets jaunes, le mouvement des Gilets jaunes qui a très mal accueilli une augmentation des prix du carburant. Donc, je pense que, et ça fera peut-être la transition avec le deuxième panel pour Ruth, je pense que la question de l'extension des marchés carbone au bâtiment est une question qui doit absolument être débattue au niveau européen, mais aussi dans les États au niveau national, puisqu'on l'a vu, et Emmanuel le dit très bien, quels États ont la capacité à compenser les mesures qui sont prises au niveau européen et pour quel impact climatique. Peut-être que c'est ce qui sera discuté aussi sur le second panel. En tout cas, on a à cœur ici en France et avec les autres organisations, également les organisations qui travaillent sur les questions climatiques, d'avoir cette discussion-là avec notre gouvernement sur ce qu'on attend des marchés carbone et sur leur impact sur les ménages, notamment les plus modestes. Donc voilà, c'est un peu la conclusion qui me semble importante de relever quant à la question du webinaire aujourd'hui. Le Fit for55 aura-t-il une conséquence heureuse ou pas sur la crise du logement?
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. I think that's a great point to close our panel on. I think we could have continued all afternoon, so I would just like to say a huge thanks to all of our panelists. I think it was really rich, and it showed just how much is at stake. I think Emmanuelle opened her input saying that she couldn't answer this question, and I think that was also part of the motivation for us organising this debate, because we're very aware of how high the stakes are from a housing perspective. We really see the opportunities, and we're really working on lots of concrete good practices in terms of one-stop shops and funding mechanisms and stuff, but we're very anxious about unintended negative social consequences as well, and we're really keen to keep the dialogue going with the Commission as this moves forward, and obviously with the other institutions and at member state level as well. So thank you very, very much. And I'd like to invite the panelists from our second panel to turn on their cameras. Thank you. So our second panel is going to focus more on this question of how the planned transition in buildings can be financed and funded in order to be truly just. And we have three speakers to help us look into this. The first one is Camille Defers from the Jacques Delors Energy Centre, where she's a research fellow in EU energy policy. The second is Guillaume Joly, who is Sustainable Buildings Officer at the European Consumer Organisation, BEUC, and Mr. Philippe Pelletier, who is the president of the French Sustainable Buildings Plan, and who has been the president of that plan since it was launched in 2009, where he's appointed by the Prime Minister. So we're going to have the same sort of format to this panel, with opening remarks from each speaker and then a question and answer to follow. So I will hand over to Camille as our first speaker.
Many thanks, Ruth, for the introduction, and many thanks as well to the previous panelists for the great, very interesting discussion. I'll take up some of these points in my opening remarks, but I think I will more focus on the Social Climate Fund that has been already mentioned, as well as the second ETS that was proposed. So yes, access to finance, is one of the key obstacles to the renovation wave, especially for not credit-worthy low-income households, as already highlighted by Louise. So 100% public financing will be necessary for these households. And so to give you an idea of the amounts we're talking about, the Buildings Performance Institute for Europe, leading think tank on buildings in Europe, estimated that public support required to trigger the renovation wave and to achieve our climate objective is 90 billion euros per year from now until 2030. So 90 billion euros, it's a lot, but it's also only 0.6% of EU GDP. And just to give you an idea, for example, Germany expenditures due to COVID crisis has been estimated at 30% of its GDP, and France at about 20%. So, I mean, if it's a matter of prioritization as well, and we see that majority of the public funds that have been spent on COVID emergency measures will not have the transformational impact expected from the renovation wave that will lead to massive job creation, as well as the reduction of European dependence on costly imported fossil fuels and energy poverty, of course, which is the topic of this afternoon. So coming back to the social climate funds, I think we would all agree that it is an unprecedented step forward in financing a just transition in buildings, and it really has the potential to be a major tool to finance deep renovation for those who need it most. What I mean by deep renovation is a renovation aiming at the highest energy performance standards, which is zero energy or even positive energy buildings. But there's a few maybe challenges associated to the social climate fund. So the key challenges in our view is that it is deeply linked to the second carbon market that has been proposed by the Commission. So it is a new carbon market that would apply on heating and road transportation from 2026. So it is linked to this ETS2 for two reasons. So first, the purpose of the Social Climate Fund is to alleviate the social impacts of ETS2. So financing not only green investment, but also social compensation, which is actually a temporary income support. And then the funding of the Social Climate Fund would be based on ETS2 revenues. And so in our view, the topic of this discussion is how to finance and fund fair transition in the building sector. And in our view, financing deep renovation of vulnerable households through this new instrument, so ETS2, raises several challenges in terms of social justice. First, because ETS2 might turn out to be a very regressive policy. I think Emmanuel highlighted very well that we lack data on worst performing households, but most importantly on vulnerable households. And although Serena from the European Commission really well highlighted as well that, I mean, there is improvements, and of course we cannot wait to have the data to act. And I think it is a very important point. However, a carbon market could have a very tangible impacts on most vulnerable people in Europe. Why? Well, it is because the carbon price will impact more heavily vulnerable households who spend a higher share of their income on energy. And the price on this carbon market, I will not enter into too technical details, but On the building sector, the price might rise to very high levels, and there's a weak price control mechanisms. So it is expected that the price on the new ETS on buildings would be higher than on the existing ETS. And to give you an idea, a CO2 price of 100 euros per ton would lead to an increase of 25% of heating bills in the EU. But this is only an average. And if you take a Polish household with a low income, with heating supplied by coal, this could reach 100% increase or even more. So there's a very high social risk that was highlighted by Sarah already. And where we see a very high danger for the EU is that actually the success of the ETS on buildings will eventually rest on national policies' fairness, as well as effective implementation of ambitious and targeted renovation policies that are currently lacking. And who will stand up to defend the EU policies when you have a Gilets jaunes type social crisis in one member state? That's actually a very, very dangerous move in our view. But with that in mind, well, the Social Climate Fund is a good step to, try to alleviate part of the social challenges, but will not be enough. Maybe the first issue is that, if you say that the purpose is to alleviate the social impacts of ETS2, you might kind of disregard the already existing energy poverty and energy inequalities in terms of housing. And then there's some design issues. First, the timing. The Social Climate Fund would take place, start operating in 2025, which is very good in terms of income support. But it's too late if you're thinking about the green investments that are required to shield vulnerable consumers from the price increase on ETS2. And as we all know, green investments, they take time and should be carried out before the introduction of the carbon price, as Sweden, actually, Sweden is a very good example of a successful carbon pricing strategy. And they actually renovated the house and decarbonized heating supplied before introducing a very high level of carbon pricing. Then there's a risk, I think as Louise already touched upon, there's a risk since energy prices are a very politically sensitive issue. There's a risk that member states use the resources for social compensation rather than green investments that would result in a more structural change. And then there's also, again, as highlighted before, it would be a plan-based fund. So member states would need to draft and submit to the Commission national social climate plans where they would define the targets. But again, these member states, many member states could fail to provide adequate support to those who need it the most. And so we need more disaggregated data that currently is lacking in many cases. So there's a risk that threaten the social acceptability of the Green Deal, the EU Green Deal. Well, yes, those are the reasons why we think that ETS2 might, it could be better not to be implemented because that would solve actually the social compensation challenge. However, the Social Climate Fund would remain an opportunity to send a very strong signal in favor of a just transition. And I think that's what the EU citizens are expecting from the EU. It is a green and just transition. And if ETS2 is abandoned, the fund could focus on targeted investments to fight energy poverty. Well, if we think about potentially, alternative funding sources for the Social Climate Fund, well, we could think of the ETS one, so the current ETS. As Louise mentioned, there's actually there's no social criteria to national member states spending from the revenues they get from ETS1. And so with the rising prices that we've seen this year, we see that there's room for, there's actually more funding available. And this year only, there has been 11 billion euros additional revenues due to price increase. And I think this is a figure from last month. So the year isn't finished, and the price rose even again this month to reach historical levels at 70 euros per ton of CO2. So I'll conclude with some remarks that have already been made of the regulatory framework. So the Social Climate Fund would also require a strengthened framework that would be consistent with the need for social justice in the transition. So first, in prioritizing deep renovation and making sure that renovation effectively leads to highest energy efficiency gains. And then a socially just public support, as highlighted already. There's a need of progressive public support according to the income level. So, I mean, financial incentives should target in priority vulnerable households. And for the remaining households, you could have a decreasing public subsidies and a greater mobilization of private finance for credit-worthy households. And I think that would be a very good opportunity for banks as well to green their balance sheets. And lastly, I mean, we should also aim to achieve broader consistency. And I think that's what the Fitfor55 package is also showing. I mean, I would agree with the previous panelists that, I mean, it is an unprecedented move forward in terms of green transition, and it's also a very comprehensive and balanced package. But we should also look at maybe EU and national level to remove fossil fuel subsidies if we're talking about potentially finding financing streams to finance a just transition. It's 50 billion euros per year in the EU, and only 4% of these fossil fuel subsidies actually benefit to households. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you very much, Camille. It's a clear message about yes to a social climate fund and perhaps no to ETS2 as the way to feed that social climate fund. Guillaume, could I hand over to you, please? And I understand you have a presentation, which I think we're just going to bring up now.
Okay, it's on. Thanks, Ruth, and hello, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to present on this question of financing from the consumer perspective. So going on to the next slide, please. The main question regarding the financing for a consumer perspective is the question of affordability, but also the access, the concrete access to financing. They are key questions of the Renovation Wave. Our stand regarding consumers is that all of us are at some point vulnerable, and at some degree vulnerable regarding the energy transition, and we need support. Most of us consumers can't afford to directly pay for our energy retrofit works via our savings. So that's where the issue of the upfront cost is key and should be addressed. It's even stronger for low income, for sure, and they need stepping stones to ensure access to financing. Because even if in the long term it's interesting to invest in retrofit, more shallow or deep retrofit, depending on your situation, climate, zones, etc., that has to be assessed. We need those financial instruments that have been mentioned on the first panel quite strongly, because the money is here. The question is how to channel it. And the question of addressing the upfront cost is key, because it can lead to solutions regarding on how to blend public and private funding. Because as mentioned before, the amount of money needed accounts in the hundreds of billions. Next slide, please. The first financial instruments I would like to introduce are the revolving funds, because they could allow for a smooth disbursement of grants. We are supportive at BUG of a 100% grant for the lowest income, the most in need, but that does not answer the disbursement question, because some of the grants are disbursed once the works are completed. So you, as a household, need to bring in all the and cover all the costs via your own capacities, which can be tricky. And even if you don't have to cover 100% of the costs at once, that means you need to pay for part of the works ahead, because the installers and builders won't work for free. So you need here a revolving fund that will step in. It's a fund that is capitalized possibly by the private sector, that is more flexible than public authorities, so that can step in ahead of the grant disbursement, pay for the upfront cost for the households, and then it's replenished once the grants can be disbursed, once the works are completed, for example. So this is the first example of a financial instruments we call for to smooth the pathway of consumers. Next slide, please. Other financial instruments are the guarantee funds and loan loss reserves. Again, the idea is to smooth out and iron out all the barriers that can be faced by households here. The guarantee funds and loan loss reserves are slightly different, but they have the same core idea. It's when a household buys a loan, those tools can step in and cover in case of default. So covering the case of default when consumers can't repay for X reasons, it induces a lower risk for the money lender, which means a lower interest rates and a broader scope of households being able to access the loan, because it's cheaper basically, and as the risk is covered, basically it's zero risk. Then even low-income households, not the lowest income, but low-income households can access that kind of funding. Here we see a central role for local government and authorities on the capitalization of those guarantee funds and loan loss reserves, and also for the coverage of the operational costs, because managing those instruments requires workforce, and that's the cost. Next slide, please. The third financial instruments are on-bill schemes, and we see them as quite an interesting tool. They are mentioned several times in the European Commission communication, including on the proposal for the Energy Efficiency Directive. So this is very interesting, we think. It has a good potential, but then we question the protection of consumers on regarding the rollout of on-bill schemes. What are they? Just in a few words, on-bill schemes are microloans attached to energy meters. So they pay for energy efficiency measures implementation, and the repayments are folded into monthly bills. Here again, they are interesting because they can cover the upfront cost. The consumer don't have to pay upfront to access the implementation of energy efficiency measures. They can be complementary with grants to shorten the repayment period and general amount, meaning once you have bought an on-bill scheme, then the local authorities, for example, can see that the energy efficiency measures were implemented and then can disburse the grant, which means you will have, as a consumer, less monthly repayment and less amount to repay. Another point we think is interesting is regarding the source of the capital and how those schemes will be paid for. Green bond issuance could be a source of cheaper capital, and it's also linked to the scaling up of the solution, because energy suppliers have the possibility to scale up because they have an implementation capacity quite high, they have the flexibility, and they can aggregate the different works, meaning the different depths, which is accurate for the green bond issuance, because financially speaking, a green bond is linked to debt, and the more debt you have to handle, the cheaper it becomes, to put it very quickly and simply. Here again, we could think of the de-risking tools I've just mentioned before, the guarantee funds and the loan loss reserves, who could be combined to unbuild schemes to further down the cost for households. And we ask for a ban on disconnection. Whenever a household buy an unbuilt schemes and benefit from energy efficiency measures, there should be a ban on disconnection. And if it's a tenant, for example, we call for a freeze on rent, because if any cost is taken on taken on board directly by the tenant, that should be translated into the rent. And this actually was done in Brussels in the 60s for another energy transition at that time, from coal to gas, to equip low-income households with gas boilers when gas was still transition energy, which is not anymore, by the way. Next slide, please. And last, financial instruments. Here, talking about equity loans and leaning on the green value of the property. So an equity loan is bought to cover once again the upfront cost of the retrofit works, and the household use the property value as a leverage. So they access the equity loans, can benefit from the energy efficiency measures and retrofit. And there is a lump sum repayment after 10 to 15 years, for example. In the meantime, they don't have any repayment to do. Again, in terms of access and cost and upfront cost, it's interesting for the households. This could be also coupled with the question of mobility loss adaptations for the elderly, who would have to decide what they want to do with the property. Do they want to sell it at the time of death, for example? So those are the few things you have to plan, because we need planning, and to be able as consumers to see forward what is coming regarding energy efficiency. Here, specific long-term guarantees are needed, so it will be more linked to the action of member states than local authorities. Next slide. And I will conclude on this, the sourcing of the funding. So talking about resilience and recovery facility and the social climate fund, both will be mainly on the stand on either grants and an incentive, or redistributional. As mentioned before, the social climate fund, it will quite certainly be based on lump sum grants and with a distributional aspects. But then for this question of financial instruments, it will be interesting even if it's not the bulk of the action, that we would be covered by both of those instruments, resilience and recovery facility, knowing that up to now only 13% was disbursed. So that leaves open the question for the 87% remaining, how could they be channeled into financial instruments, for example, the one mentioned before, and same for the Social Climate Fund. And I will finish here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think that gave us some really practical tools for the implementation of the Renovation Wave, more at the national and local level. We're running a little bit late. I think we can probably eat into, if we need to, the Q&A time a bit, because we have about half an hour for Q&A and conclusions. But I'd like to give the floor now to Mr. Philippe Pelletier.
Merci à vous. Je vais essayer de ne pas occuper trop de temps, mais j'ai tout de même quelques éléments que je veux partager avec vous. La première observation, dans la lignée de ce que Guillaume vient d'expliquer, c'est que je voudrais rappeler que si la question du financement de la rénovation est évidemment une question importante, on ne saurait réduire l'ensemble des questions qui entourent la décision de rénovation à la seule question du logement, du financement. En d'autres termes, un ménage ou le maire d'une petite ville ont le même sujet, qui est un sujet d'organisation, par où je commence, quel type de travaux je vais faire, un sujet d'acceptabilité, est-ce que je vais accepter la rénovation de mon logement qui va se faire en ma présence le plus souvent, et un grand besoin dans le maquis administratif et des aides d'être accompagné. En somme, la question du financement est importante, mais il est très important de retenir qu'elle n'est pas la seule. Et dans un travail récent que j'avais fait autour de la rénovation du parc éducatif, en associant des élus locaux à la réflexion, nous avions observé que la question du financement arrivait de mémoire en 7e ou 8e place, après toute une série de sujets qui tient notamment à la bonne connaissance de leur parc, ce qui n'était pas le cas. Deuxième observation, vu du côté des ménages, il y a 4 sortes de financement possibles, et vous allez voir qu'on joue en France avec certains d'entre eux, mais pas encore avec tous. Le premier, le plus évident, celui qu'on a utilisé, c'est la subvention. Elle a été considérée comme nécessaire pour susciter l'adhésion des ménages, et elle s'est accompagnée, suivant les moments, d'un ciblage social ou d'une marge sociale un peu plus large, qui a consisté à accepter de subventionner l'ensemble des ménages, même si les taux diffèrent suivant le niveau de ressources des ménages. Le deuxième point, qui a été un grand échec en France, c'est celui du prêt. Nous avons un mal fou à mobiliser les banques autour du financement de la rénovation, et on comprend assez bien pourquoi. Toutes les banques, tous les grands réseaux mutualistes sont dans une logique d'industrialisation de leur activité, d'accroissement de leur productivité, de prudence dans la mobilisation de leurs fonds propres compte tenu des règles prudentielles que le système Bâle III leur impose. Et face à cela, le financement de la rénovation est un outil qui tient plus du sur-mesure que du prêt-à-porter industriel, bref, qui ne rencontre pas la disponibilité des banques. Et c'est un de mes grands échecs dans les discussions que j'ai eues avec les réseaux bancaires, de ne pas réussir à les emmener dans la danse au rythme auquel on l'aurait souhaité. Troisième poste qui est souvent négligé, c'est celui de la richesse que les ménages, même modestes, détiennent entre leurs mains et qu'ils n'exploitent pas. À quoi sert-il qu'un ménage qui est propriétaire d'un pavillon et d'une petite épargne continue à laisser le pavillon perdre de sa valeur en raison de son caractère énergivore et laisse dormir cette épargne qui ne rapporte plus rien sur son compte bancaire. N'est-il pas intelligent de leur suggérer de conserver la partie d'épargne nécessaire au traitement des accidents de la vie et de les inciter à investir l'épargne disponible dans les travaux de rénovation du logement qui maintiendront sa valeur et donc assureront au patrimoine familial, serait-il tout petit, une valeur maintenue. Et puis, on a l'autre idée qui est que la propriété d'un bien immobilier, qui est tout de même le cas dans notre pays de près de 60% des ménages, la propriété d'un bien immobilier, surtout quand on a vieilli, est libre de charges d'emprunt et on a là une valeur sur laquelle on peut asseoir la mobilisation d'argent nécessaire au financement des travaux. Alors, on appelle ça l'hypothèque rechargeable, on appelle ça, on peut appeler ça le démembrement de propriété en indiquant à ces ménages qu'il pourrait être intéressant qu'ils cèdent la nue propriété du bien et que ce faisant, ils vivent dans des conditions meilleures, la vente en viager, etc. Il y a un certain nombre de voies de valorisation de l'actif immobilier qui ne prennent pas bien en France parce que les générations qui sont propriétaires des logements ont une très forte volonté de transmettre aux enfants une sorte d'extraordinaire contresens parce que les enfants, dans leur grande majorité, ont plutôt l'envie de voir les parents bien vieillir chez eux et bénéficier de leurs ressources. Mais enfin, ce malentendu pèse sur la capacité de financement. Alors, en France, on a commencé par jouer sur un couple subvention-fiscalité en somme, en subventionnant les ménages modestes à travers les aides que l'Agence nationale de l'habitat met en place et en inventant un crédit d'impôt permettant aux ménages les plus aisés de voir ainsi leur fiscalité être réduite par les travaux de rénovation qu'ils réalisent. Ceci a conduit à un système dont le caractère juste n'était pas évident et on est aujourd'hui vers un système unifié dans lequel le crédit d'impôt a disparu et un grand système de subvention qu'on appelle aujourd'hui MaPrimeRénov', extrêmement dématérialisé dans sa mise en œuvre, irrigue la rénovation des logements. Pour vous faire une idée, en 2021, c'est 700 000 logements qui auront bénéficié de MaPrimeRénov' à des niveaux différents. Plus on est modeste, plus la prime est élevée. Donc l'avantage, c'est que cette sorte d'industrialisation de la distribution des subventions n'a pas supprimé l'affectation sociale et très sociale de la subvention qui est restée très majoritaire dans le système. Ça, c'est la bonne nouvelle. La mauvaise nouvelle, c'est que MaPrimeRénov' a pour l'essentiel financé des gestes de rénovation et que la rénovation globale, en une ou plusieurs fois que l'on appelle de nos voeux et qui est nécessaire pour remplir nos objectifs européens et nationaux, ne sont qu'une petite partie de MaPrimeRénov'. Donc, voilà l'outil qui est en place et nous sommes en train de mettre en place à partir du 1er janvier prochain un complément pour assurer aux ménages les plus modestes un financement de 100% de la rénovation qui consiste à considérer que par le biais de la subvention MaPrimeRénov' et de son complément que je n'ai pas le temps d'expliquer sous forme des certificats d'économie d'énergie, les C2E, nous arrivons à financer, si j'y ajoute des subventions que les métropoles, les régions, les départements apportent, nous arrivons à financer 80 à 90% de la dépense. Il reste donc à charge du ménage une somme de 2 000 à 3 000 euros qui, pour les ménages les plus fragiles, est hors de proportion. Et nous inventons ce qu'on appelle le prêt avance mutation, qui sera distribué, lui, par 2 réseaux bancaires, la Banque Postale et le Crédit Mutuel, à partir de janvier, et qui consiste à dire, on vous prête sans autre garantie la somme nécessaire qui reste à votre charge, vous rembourserez les intérêts au fur et à mesure où le crédit sera vivant, mais le capital ne sera remboursé que in fine au moment de la vente du logement ou au moment de l'ouverture de votre succession. C'est quelque chose pour assurer en somme un financement 100% au profit des ménages les plus fragiles. J'ajoute, et je termine comme ça, que ainsi nous gardons en France comme tout à fait prioritaire la lutte contre la précarité énergétique, même si cette action a été englobée dans une action plus vaste et plus massifiée que je viens d'esquisser à très grands traits. Mais il faut que l'on ait conscience que la lutte contre la précarité énergétique, comme le sujet général de la rénovation énergétique, n'est qu'une partie du grand sujet que nous allons avoir à porter, qui est la rénovation tout court des logements et la lutte contre les précarités, pas seulement énergétiques. Nous voyons poindre en France un vieillissement accéléré de la population qui, compte tenu des chiffres démographiques affolants qui s'annoncent, aujourd'hui 2 millions de Français ont plus de 85 ans, en 2035-2040, et je serai du lot, si je suis toujours en vie, il y aura près de 5 millions de Français de plus de 85 ans. Il est donc hors de propos d'imaginer de les recueillir dans des structures collectives. Il va falloir qu'ils continuent à occuper le plus longtemps possible les 18 millions de maisons individuelles qu'ils occupent aujourd'hui, ce qui veut dire qu'il y a un travail d'adaptation du logement au vieillissement et au handicap qui va s'ajouter à la lutte contre la précarité énergétique. C'est donc un sujet global de rénovation qu'il nous faut traiter. Et moi, je pense, et je termine ainsi, que la question des financements ne sera une réussite que si, d'une part, on a des systèmes de garantie facilement mobilisables, que ce soit la garantie de l'État ou que ce soit des garanties d'organismes européens qui permettent de sécuriser les financements qu'on distribue, et que c'est une palette de solutions de financement qui sera efficace parce que les besoins d'un ménage très précaire ou les besoins d'un ménage moins modeste de financement ne sont pas identiques et les techniques mises en œuvre ne sont pas les mêmes pour l'ensemble des ménages.
Thank you very much. That was really very interesting. I see that we already have a couple of questions in the chat. And I had a question for all of you, really, which was about financing based on energy savings. And one of the things that we come across a lot in terms of the most vulnerable households is that energy savings models don't work very well because the way that they can use the house can be different, and for lots of reasons, and also because people living in cold homes and living in thermal discomfort don't necessarily spend the money, and so they won't save the money. And I would be interested to hear from many of the speakers on that, on whether that's a problem that you're aware of and how to address it for the more vulnerable households. Guillaume?
Yes, thanks. I can start opening the conversation on that. I think what you might refer to is the question of the golden rule, meaning that investment in energy efficiency, their monthly repayment should cover the should be covered by the energy savings induced by the retrofit works. This might be relevant for middle-income households, but as you mentioned, some low-income just can't afford to have any consumption, or so that low that it's not relevant to plan for the calculation of the cost optimal level of investment. So I agree this is something to have in mind. Like it should not be the alpha and omega and the silver bullet to all the retrofit planning. What can be taken into account is the access to non-monetarized up to now aspects as thermal comfort, health, even the sustainability of housing itself, because if you're not able to have a warm house, well, for sure, first you can be sick, but also housing is not appropriate anymore because you have some mold developing. It's even more cost piling over the years because it can provoke decay. So yes, I agree. Warning here on those questions of the calculation of the optimal return on investment. We have to be more flexible than that.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
J'y vais. Camille, je vous précède. Je dis un mot. Je suis tout à fait d'accord avec ce que Guillaume vient de développer. Nous avons eu, et je parle pour les Français, nous avons eu une approche trop économique et donc trop théorique du sujet de la lutte contre la précarité énergétique, en pensant qu'il nous fallait avant tout arriver à réaliser des économies d'énergie qui allaient provoquer des économies tout court pour les ménages. La vraie vie n'est pas celle-là. La plupart des ménages en situation de précarité énergétique ne se chauffent pas. Et donc, les travaux de rénovation de leur logement auront pour effet ce qu'on appelle un effet rebond, qui consiste à leur faire dépenser davantage d'énergie qu'ils n'en dépensaient avant, puisqu'ils n'en consommaient pas ou peu. Et donc, on est dans quelque chose dans lequel l'économie d'énergie, elle est une base théorique, mais qui ne permet pas d'asseoir un développement à grande échelle. C'est plutôt dans un immobilier plus sophistiqué qu'est l'immobilier d'entreprise, où on peut imaginer ce genre d'opération dans lequel on finance sur les économies d'énergie les travaux eux-mêmes. Il y a quelques modèles qui tournent et qui fonctionnent dans ce cadre-là, mais je ne crois pas que ce soit adapté aux logements très modestes. Et la deuxième observation, je suis parfaitement d'accord avec Guillaume, il faut que l'on dépasse l'approche économique de ce sujet pour avoir une approche plus sanitaire de la question, comme les Anglais ont su, avant nous les Français, le montrer. Les Anglais, depuis longtemps, raisonnent en disant qu'une livre d'investi dans des travaux de rénovation énergétique économise 40 cents dans les budgets de santé du public. Ce lien entre la santé et l'immobilier est tout à fait puissant. Et l'épreuve que nous venons tous de traverser va, me semble-t-il, encore renforcer la place que la santé va prendre dans nos vies. Et donc, Guillaume a raison de dire qu'une pathologie, qu'un logement énergivore et détenu par des personnes précaires est un logement qui est mal chauffé, puisqu'on chauffe l'air extérieur plus que le local lui-même, et que donc ce logement-là développe des pathologies qui provoquent des pathologies sur les personnes qui occupent les logements. Et il y a là une chaîne qu'il faut rompre. La question de la santé est d'autant plus puissante que nous allons devoir, comme je le suggérais en terminant, vivre plus longtemps, plus durablement dans nos logements. Et cette question, on la voit à travers le froid en hiver, on la voit à travers le chaud en été. Quel va être le grand défi que nous allons avoir tous ensemble à relever? C'est ce qu'on appelle, d'un joli mot, le confort d'été, mais qui consiste à dire qu'il faut faire en sorte que les gens, et notamment les gens âgés, qui sont très sensibles aux variations climatiques, puissent vivre dans leur logement. C'est un problème pour certains de survie, c'est-à-dire ne pas être dans une situation où la chaleur extérieure rend insupportable l'habitat. Et donc, nous avons une approche sanitaire qui est très forte, spécialement du côté des plus précaires et qui éloigne donc un peu ces calculs économiques vertueux.
Thank you.
Oui, si je...
I think another question
Okay.
that comes to mind listening to the three of you is this, that it's not all about funding and finance. There are many barriers to renovation, and especially to deep renovation for the most vulnerable households. And I think the Fit455 package has put some ideas on the table about how member states can overcome some of those other barriers. There's a lot of focus on one-stop shops and on kind of outreach. And I wonder if you would be able to share, maybe especially from the French perspective, any examples of the kind of successful one-stop shops or other interventions of that type. And I also just realized that Camille, I think, wanted to come in on the last question, and I didn't bring her in, so apologies for that. Maybe we can hear from her first and then come back to this question. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that indeed this multiple benefit approach is very important when we talk about financing, the financing needs for the renovation. When Philippe talks about the health impact, I mean, it's been measured by the EU Agency for Improvement of Living Conditions that not only even considering energy savings, the cost of health and loss of productivity linked to inadequate housing is 200 billion euros per year. So it's almost the same as the investment required to deeply renovate the building stock. So I think indeed we need to go beyond the energy savings on this point. I think we have very good example of one-stop shops in France, and I think Philippe knows it better than I, so I leave the floor to Philippe.
J'en dis un mot. Nous avons fait le choix de développer une plateforme dématérialisée qui tient lieu, si l'on veut, de guichet unique, qui permet d'accéder à la subvention distribuée par l'Agence nationale de l'habitat. C'est le système MaPrimeRénov' que j'évoquais tout à l'heure. Et nous sommes en train de développer partout sur le territoire, dans un partenariat intelligent qui a fini par se nouer entre les 13 régions françaises et l'État, des lieux d'information et de conseils gratuits ouverts aux ménages qui assurent un maillage géographique du territoire de telle nature que tout ménage trouve à 15-30 minutes de chez lui quelqu'un qui peut l'aider. Et nous avons, et c'est le dernier point, nous avons pensé qu'il ne suffit pas d'informer et de conseiller, mais qu'il faut accompagner. Et là, nous sommes en train de mettre en place un système qui va démarrer en janvier prochain, qui est un système dans lequel on va en somme trouver des groupements constitués principalement par le monde associatif qui œuvre autour de l'accompagnement logement, pour accompagner les ménages dans leur décision de rénovation. Ça veut dire les aider à faire le diagnostic, les aider à déterminer quels sont les travaux qui ont un caractère prioritaire compte tenu du bâti, les aider à faire le choix des entreprises, les aider à mobiliser les subventions et financements disponibles. Donc, une sorte, ce qu'on appelle banalement dans le domaine de la construction, de l'AMO, c'est-à-dire de l'assistance à maîtrise d'ouvrage. Voilà, c'est ce rôle-là qui va être en partie aidé, en partie subventionné, en partie supporté par le ménage si son niveau de ressources le permet. Voilà, donc un système très dématérialisé, unique pour financer et subventionner, un réseau sur tout le territoire de conseillers pour informer et conseiller, et un système d'accompagnement qui se met en place pour ceux qui le souhaiteront.
Thanks, Camille, and then Guillaume.
Oui, pour rebondir brièvement sur ce qui vient d'être dit, effectivement, l'assistance technique est un élément essentiel de la rénovation et c'est aussi quelque chose qui doit être financé en partie par des fonds publics. Ce n'est pas forcément très cher par rapport au niveau d'investissement qui est nécessaire dans la rénovation à proprement parler. Et ce qui a été estimé, la même étude sur laquelle je m'appuie du Building Institute Europe, à environ 1 à 2 milliards par an. Donc, ce n'est pas cher et c'est essentiel en fait pour atteindre les ménages et faire comprendre aussi et les accompagner dans une démarche qui peut être compliquée.
To build on what was said by Camille and Philippe, we are very supportive at the book of one-stop shops that cover administrative, technical, and financial questions. And that provide real support. Up to now, consumers are left alone facing the choice of installers, most of them not accredited yet. So you have a strong need for a scaling up of the training and accreditation of its installers. You have a wealth of grants and financial offers. Not enough reliable and affordable ones, but the existing ones are plenty. So you need a real support here for consumers, and that shall go till the point of supporting the consumers when they have to fill in the forms to apply for the grants, for example, when needed. At Berk, regarding the question of public or private, we are quite agnostic. You have a few different examples. What we say is that the one-stop shops will quite certainly be a blending, once again, of public and private solutions, of free services accessible to all. And what we say is that if, in any case, some of the services of support would have to be paid for by consumers, that should not be at any upfront cost to address the question of accessibility. And what we also call for, realizing that with the scaling up of the number of retrofits and regarding the demographics as well of the installers, one-stop shops should support the newly accredited installers and mirror somehow the services provided to consumers with services to installers, also to have some appeal for installers to join the offer. And one point I forgot, maybe if I may, quickly, it's one-stop shop should be, as Louise mentioned, providing services tailor-made for consumers, and also to the case of multi-unit buildings, because their complexity here requires a higher level of complex support. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any more questions. I think it's the end of the afternoon. So I think I would like to bring in Freek to share some concluding remarks. Freek, are you there?
I'm here. I listened carefully during the last 2 hours. So good afternoon, everybody, and I'll keep it short because I think it was a very...
Freek, we seem to have a little bit of a connection issue.
Do you hear me?
Now we do, and now we see
frozen my screen.
Frozen, and we didn't hear you, but now it seems to be working.
Ah, you hear me now?
It's cutting. Let's give it one last try.
You don't hear me. You don't hear me, I guess.
No, now it's fine.
It's fine. I'm very sorry about this. I don't know. I think it's because all the people working at home now that the internet is overloaded or something like that. But I just said while you were not hearing me that I'll keep it very short because we're losing listeners to the session. But just a thank you, first of all, to all the speakers. I think it was a high quality input and good discussion we had. I just have 4 or 5 quick points to share with you. I'm not an expert, but just from listening carefully to you. First of all, I just want to say I listened a couple of days ago to a conference debate where the Director General of DG Employment of the European Commission spoke, and he said that the yellow vest movement in France came as a total surprise for the Commission officials, and that it opened their eyes for how fragile society can be. And I was actually surprised that he was so surprised, because for us it was not at all a surprise. And my first point is, let's not be surprised that there is a yellow vest movement in the implementation of the Green Deal if we don't do it properly and with enough attention to the social consequences. So that's very quickly the first point. I think I heard everybody, without exception, saying that there is quite a lot of social challenges that need to be addressed and that we don't have the solutions for all of them. And I think we're confronted with the need for speed to act on the climate versus the need for data to address the social challenges. And we'll have to find the right balance there. But let's also not say or claim that there is not sufficient data constantly. There is probably more data out there than we imagine at the moment. And I think the other thing that we heard about the social challenge is that we cannot just leave the social consequences of the renovation wave and the climate deal to the national level. That is probably a mistake. Some countries will deal with that effectively, some other countries much less. So I think there is also a role for the European Union to help member states overcome the negative social consequences. Very quickly, the third point, I heard reference to the middle income groups quite a number of times. We hear that it is important. It's not only about the most excluded and the most vulnerable, but let's focus on the middle income groups without or not at the expense of the most excluded, because that's often what happens. So when I heard Louise saying, let's target the worst performing buildings and the most vulnerable people, or start with them, it makes sense to me. The fourth quick point is that targeting of the worst performing housing and the most vulnerable people is a challenge and remains a challenge. I think if we want to maximize the social and environmental gain of the renovation wave and the Green Deal, we probably have to try to reach both. I see a lot of attention to social housing when it comes to renovation, which I think is great. It's very helpful. It's welcome. But if we look at who is most vulnerable at the moment, we tend to forget the poor and very poor homeowners and the poor, very poor tenants in the private rental market, especially those ones that live in cold homes, which is the people that don't have the means to heat the housing and for whom energy renovation is only a cost. And maybe also to say that the identification of the most vulnerable groups is not just a technical issue based on data, but it's also an inherently political issue. There is the question of deserving and undeserving target groups also in relation to the Green Deal. And then the last point I want to make is on finance and funding. It will be absolutely key. Also, the EU role in making funding and financing opportunities available is absolutely key. We have to remember that we start from a situation where there is already a housing affordability crisis. We cannot afford further house price increases, certainly not for the most vulnerable. I asked a question earlier on in the chat about the role of intermediaries to channel the financing, especially EU financing, to the end consumers, and I'm still not entirely sure how that works and what the rules say. I wait with impatience for the answer that the Commission official promised, but I see that there is a tendency to look for big intermediaries like the social housing sector, but whether they can reach the people that need most help is questionable, of course. And I'm happy to hear that many people made the case that we have to move away from simplistic investment arguments where we say that the investment in energy renovation can be earned back by a cheaper energy bill, and that for some vulnerable people and vulnerable homeowners, we need 100% financial support. And I want to quickly end with one simple suggestion. Because it's all very technical and very difficult, and sometimes we get lost in details, but could we not all argue together that no one should be evicted in the process of delivering the Green Deal? So in other words, that renovictions should be avoided in the implementation of the Green Deal. Because we speak a lot about vulnerable consumers, vulnerable homeowners, small homeowners, but we have not said much about the big investors who are already using energy efficiency renovation as a means to perform renovation. So maybe we should just have that as a common message: no renovictions as part of the Green Deal. That's it from me, Ruth.
Okay, thank you very much, Craig. Very sharp and concise conclusions. I think unless there's anything that any of the panelists would like to bring to the table in terms of a concluding remark, we can close here. When I give the last opportunity if anyone wants to take the floor. Okay, great. Really very sincere thanks again for your very expert contributions. Have a nice afternoon. Bye.
Thank you.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.